Today on UVA Legends podcast, I have my old pal Kevin Edds. Kevin is a director, producer of the history of Virginia Cavalier football, an amazing brand guy. When I did my startup, I went to Kevin to do a video for my website, did an amazing job. Kevin, great to see you again. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, thanks for having me, Julian. I appreciate it.
Of course. I also forgot to mention your better half, Adrian Edds, is a great writer. Used to write for the Arlington Magazine. I'm sure she still does. Someone I look up to a lot as well.
Yes, and
But
another UVA grad.
oh, that's right. I forgot Adrian is a good person like the rest of us. But well, let me just give a little bit of your bio. You're a '94 grad of UVA. Kevin, where'd you grow up again?
Richmond,
Richmond guy. Where'd you go to high school?
Hermitage High School.
Oh, Hermitage. Okay. 95 UVA. You caught on with Discovery, and you were, a writer, director, producer, kind of worked your way up, worked for various companies. You did the movie with your own production company, but now you work for Curiosity Stream as a streaming service for Discovery. You're VP brand strategist for Curiosity Stream. Kevin, did I get most of that right?
You did. Yeah, Curiosity Stream is actually independent of Discovery. It was started by the founder of Discovery Channel,
Mhm.
but we are basically the Netflix for nerds, the history, sorry, the Hulu for history buffs. So really, if you want to see a documentary, anything from science to space to history to wildlife, just check out Curiosity Stream. And I'm head of the marketing department here and just having a great time working with documentaries, which is just, where I ended up going in my career. After I left Discovery, I was in the marketing department there and then produced the documentary for UVA football.
Yeah. Well, before we get to UVA football, when you think about documentaries, who are some of your role models? Like obviously, I will watch anything that Ken Burns puts out. Like I've seen baseball 50 times, jazz, World War II. So when I think of documentaries, I think of Ken Burns. But I grew up with World at War, was a World War II documentary that used to be on the public TV back then. But what about you? Who are some of your influences in
Yeah.
documentaries?
Ken Burns, definitely. And I mean, if you see my film, I mean, he's very much his style is represented in my documentary. Love Michael Moore. I mean, he had some really provocative documentaries over the years, Bowling for Columbine. I personally don't think I could do that style where I'm on camera. I like to be behind the camera. I like to do a lot of research and writing and the post-production, things like that. I also love some of my favorite documentaries, and I'm going to space on the directors, but Man on Wire is fantastic about the gentleman in the 70s who set up a wire between the Twin Towers in Manhattan and walked across it illegally. That's a great documentary. And then for anyone who's looking for something fun, The King of Kong, A Fistful of Quarters is my favorite documentary of all time. And it's a look back at the late 70s, early 80s rise of Donkey Kong, the video game, and two guys in the 2010s or so who were competing for the world record in it. There's good guys, bad guys, there's cheating, there's world records. It's such a fantastic documentary. I can't recommend it more highly.
It kind of reminds me of Seinfeld's idea of doing a documentary about was it corn puffs? What is Seinfeld's got a new documentary about?
Pop-Tarts.
Yeah. It's kind of the same
Yes,
thing. Just take something a little bit.
exactly.
Yeah, and just
Yeah,
and
the
just
nostalgia part of it is just such a hook for those of us that grew up in that era, literally with, just a couple of quarters in our hands and video games being this big machine in in an arcade or a skating rink.
yeah. When my parents were bowling, I was in the on the arcade playing Donkey Kong or Asteroids or whatever.
Exactly.
What are the keys to a successful documentary? Like when you're making a movie, a fictionalized movie, a drama, a comedy. You have a lot of license to build and you have a plot, I guess you have a climax or whatever. But documentaries are a little bit different because it's factually based. What are the keys to a successful documentary?
Yeah, well, like nonfiction, I mean, you want to have an arc. You want to be able to introduce interesting characters and have them go from one place to another, whether it's, geographically or over the course of time in their lives. I think that, the hardest part of documentaries today is distribution, how to get them out to the public. Netflix has a lot of documentaries. Curiosity Stream is filled with documentaries. But it is challenging to be able to find the funding to produce them. Fortunately, today with technology, it's a lot easier to shoot and to edit. I mean, people make documentaries using their iPhones. It's crazy. I mean, when I was at UVA, I was in the last class that graduated in the rhetoric and communication studies major. We didn't have anything close to editing equipment. I mean, there was an AV club that I remember at UVA back then, but that just allowed me personally to focus more on writing. I remember having classes on the art of persuasion, Aristotle's rhetoric,
Yeah, me too.
audience analysis, things like that. And technology changes all the time. It will continue to change. So, the things that I learned when I first entered the industry, in editing, reel to reel, which no longer exists, and to now, you have digital editing. Like I said, you can edit on your phone now. It just things are just changing all the time. There's new technology now, which can, for example, Apple has Final Cut Pro X. They have a new feature where you can take a shot that you've shot of somebody walking down the street, and you can slow-mo it, and it will use AI to generate extra frames in between so that it won't look stunted and stilted. It'll look really smooth, like you shot it at 90 frames per second. So I don't mean to get into the weeds, but I love the technology aspect of it too. But to just put a point on it, what makes a good documentary is the story. If you can find a story that captivates people that no one has heard about, that just grabs someone's attention, I mean, it's like gold. So, I don't know if the UVA football history was gold or not, but to UVA fans, it might have been. And I got a lot of emails and people coming up to me at different events who were really appreciative of the stories that I was able to collect with the help of a lot of other people. So, that was a little bit of gold right there.
Yeah, real quick, RCS is gone. I didn't realize that. So rhetoric and communication studies is what do they call it now?
It's it's the media studies
Right.
department, and I believe that you have to apply at the end of your first year or second year. So you have
Wow.
to get in just like in the comm school. So you now have to apply and get accepted into the media studies program.
So it's less about the content and about the Platonic method, Aristotle. Oh, you still learn, I assume, those principles that we learned when I was in RCS 101?
Oh, you took RCS 101?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Oh,
everyone did.
excellent. That's great. That's great to know that. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those same principles obviously still exist. Just the art of storytelling, will never change.
Yeah. So Kevin, you mentioned you took a kind of a swipe at yourself by mentioning the UVA project. Maybe it's not as appreciated as it should be, and I identify with that. I do a lot of local media, and I feel like my audience is limited by geography and hobby or interest. So that does speak to me in that I feel like if I pick a vanilla topic that can go worldwide, I have a better audience. But I do have loyal followings that enjoy the passion for UVA or Northern Virginia sports. Now, when you thought about doing a documentary about UVA football, um, the obvious question is our basketball history is much more glorious. I mean, we were bad in both for the history of the school, for most of the history of the school, but we're bad in both.
Hmm.
But we did have some happy times in football, but in basketball, ever since Wally Walker and Barry Parker and then Ralph Sampson came, and then after the ACC was formed, UVA has had a pretty positive basketball history. We're thought of as a basketball school. Football, we really did struggle until the George Welsh years, even though we had some bright moments. Why did you decide to do a documentary about UVA football of all things?
Yeah, like so that was one of the things that was surprising to me because I always had that impression too. I was really spoiled when I was a senior in high school in Richmond. in 1989, UVA was winning the ACC conference championship, going to the Citrus Bowl, won 10 games. I come my first year, we're ranked number one in the country. I mean, it was a roller coaster ride, and so I was really spoiled from my fandom. But over the years, I would read a little historical nugget here or there. A good friend of mine, an historian named Coy Barefoot, used to write these little history articles for the saber.com. And he was someone who I look at as like a sort of an inspiration for me, getting started on the documentary. And it turns out that when college football began in the in 1869, believe it or not, UVA, you know, we think played a game in 1871, just 2 years later. I was in the archives at UVA trying to find some historical reference to that. There are some mentions of it, but nothing. I couldn't find a score, nothing that I could really solidify UVA as we would have been the fourth oldest or tied for the fourth oldest program in the country, if I could find that. But when the program started, when the current UVA administration acknowledges the UVA football program starting in 1888, it was the first football team in the South. So kind of had a head start on everyone, ahead of UNC and NC State. I mean, there was no Florida State back then. So that period of the 1890s up through like the 1920s, we had a head start. We were the biggest program in the state. There were UVA alums that actually went down to Blacksburg and started their program, a decade or so later and helped them out. But
That's a bad
UVA
move.
really was the crown jewel of the South. We were the first program to beat one of the established Northeast Ivy League schools like Harvard and Princeton and Penn and Yale. Those were the powerhouses back then. UVA was the first Southern team to beat one of those teams in, I think it was like 1910. So we had a lot of, success there. But, another thing that was really interesting was just the UVA administration's role in the formation of the sport of football itself. UVA's president, Alderman, and their athletic director, William Lambeth. If you go to UVA, if you're familiar with Lambeth Field and the Lambeth Colonnades and the Lambeth Apartments, that was the site of UVA's football stadium,
Yeah.
going all the way back to probably like I said, the 1890s. It was made out of wood back then. But those two gentlemen were really involved in was the precursor to the NCAA. William Lambeth was on the NCAA football rules committee. So they were changing rules all the time. What was a legal tackle? What was illegal? You can't tackle below the knees. How many yards to get a first down and things like that. And one of the significant rule changes that William Lambeth was involved in was I won't call it the invention of the forward pass, but it was the sort of, let's say, the growth of the forward pass. Up until I believe it was 1910, you could pass the ball, but it had to be lateral. It had to be behind the line of scrimmage. You could not pass the ball forward. And so in order to try to spread the field out to lessen the chances for injuries, because people were playing it like rugby, like just these scrums and guys, punching was allowed. You were allowed to punch someone 3 times before you were kicked out of a game. That was in the rules, but they wanted to spread the field out. They required, what was it, 7 men on the line of scrimmage so that you couldn't have, one guy hiking the ball and 10 guys in the backfield all running forward, just crashing into each other. But William Lambeth, said, hey, let's try the forward pass and allow it, across the line of scrimmage. But they wanted to do a test case. So in the spring, I believe it was 1910, forgive me, it's been a while since I looked at all of the dates. The UVA football team held a scrimmage at Lambeth Field where they practiced with this new set of rules. And then William Lambeth, and we've seen his writing in the margins of these letters that had the rules in it, said, experiments went well, the game looks great with these new rules. And they pushed forward with the new rules. And in that season, the forward pass across the line of scrimmage was allowed. I believe an incomplete pass led to a 15-yard penalty.
Wow.
So it was a really dangerous play still in terms of, whether you wanted to attempt it or not. But I actually worked with some folks to have a plaque installed at Lambeth Field. So if anyone's walking, you know, along the colonnades to go to where the bridge is to go over to JPJ, look for the plaque there that talks about the beginning of the forward pass that happened right there, at UVA in Charlottesville.
That's really cool. Um, if I could go back just for a second, in your movie, I thought was really cool, which I didn't know. Obviously, there's a close relation between rugby and football, and football derived from rugby, and sometimes teams played both games, and they played different styles. But there was a rugby school. I believe the building may be even still there. I'm not sure, but the rugby road was the connector from the school to on grounds, and that's where all the fraternities are, where all the partying happens now. I thought it was really cool. Part of your documentary. Did you know that when you were a student at UVA?
No, no. I mean, I didn't know why Rugby Road was named the way that it was, and that there's a rugby school in England, and that is where the real birth of American football, if you want to call it that, takes place, is where they were playing soccer, they were playing football, and a boy picked up the ball and ran with it, and the students loved it and decided to create the game of rugby, which was named after the rugby school. So it's interesting that the road that leads to UVA, you look at Mad Bowl, that was the site of the first football game ever in UVA football history was Mad Bowl. And so Rugby Road runs right along that, which is pretty cool. And another little side note is that Mad Bowl was used as an athletic field for quite a while before Lambeth Stadium was built. But the UVA baseball team played a scrimmage, I think it was in 1905, against the Boston Red Sox. It's the first game in Boston Red Sox history, a spring training game, and it took place at UVA in Mad Bowl. That's pretty crazy.
That's awesome. Um, Kevin, did they ever play a football game on the lawn in the early days?
Students did, yes, but it
Yeah,
was just students having fun, and it was 50, 50 men per side.
yeah, exactly. I'm sure that was pretty to watch. Everything at UVA is about Jefferson, but also there's Civil War history. What about the connection between Wahoowa and the name Cavalier, and Wahoos, the nickname Wahoos? Is there a connection between that and in the Civil War?
Well, the connection actually is I mean, nicknames for college athletics really were just based on what the news writers would write about them. It wasn't necessarily anything that was stitched onto a uniform or painted on a sign or anything like that. And so when UVA first started their very first team, their uniforms were scarlet red and silver gray, which were reminiscent of the uniforms of the Confederacy. Um, Unfortunately, when they were playing in the red Virginia clay, they turned pink. So it was kind of embarrassing. And so they, or at least to them, and so as the story goes, they had a meeting amongst the students. Literally, it's the old YMCA. It's Madison Hall, right where Mad Bowl is. They held the meeting there and try to decide on the new school colors. And a student had a scarf that was orange and blue, and someone said, "How about this?" And so they chose those colors. And so from that point forward, orange and blue were the school colors. They had striped sleeves, like you see Princeton had
Yeah.
that style with black and orange, and UVA had blue and orange. UVA was called the Tigers for a while because of that. I think they were called the Virginians for a while. And then it was, I think, 1923 when they had a contest for a new fight song, that the Cavalier song was a song that won, and so they became the Virginia Cavaliers in the 1920s.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that the northern schools from Northeast dominated football and rugby, but football in the early days. Why is that? Why? Well, in the South, was it horse racing going on? What were they doing in the South that made them behind the North in terms of sports?
Yeah, I think that I think up north schools are a lot closer to each other. It's a lot easier to go back and forth. They were already They already had crew competitions with each
Mhm.
other, baseball games that they played against each other. So I think that that was kind of a natural thing that once football kind of came about as a sport, that they added that, to the athletics departments. In the South, I mean, the schools were, still the population itself was still recovering from the Civil War. Just to be able to go to school was such a luxury. So to be able to go to school, get an education, and then, go back and use your education in whatever profession it was, whether it was, law school, med school, whatever the case may be, business school. I just don't think that sports were a high priority in the South at that time.
Yeah. So we did have a head start on many of the Southern schools, um, but I think our first period of real success was under Frank Murray, and a player who I believe is the only Hall of Famer in UVA history, I believe, is Bill Dudley.
Bill
I might
Dudley
is he? Yeah, I might be wrong, but Bill Dudley is in the Hall of Fame. Came to UVA as a punter and a kicker, but ended up having an amazing career.
at
Uh,
16 years old.
60, is that right?
He's
Yes.
16.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about Bill. I know you played for the Redskins and the Steelers. Tell us a little bit about Bill Dudley.
Bill's great. I'm so glad that I did the documentary when I did, before a lot of these legends, passed. Um, Bill was my number one goal to get. He's to this day still the only UVA player to be selected number one in the NFL draft.
Oh, is that right?
I think Chris Long was selected number two, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but Bill Dudley was incredible. I think that in the NFL and maybe even in college, he's scored seven different ways, whether it was passing the ball, running the ball, catching the ball, kicking extra points, field goals, interception return. Gosh, he might have even tackled someone for a safety. He was just a freak of nature, and perhaps the slowest guy on the team, but supposedly in space, he had just moves that just no one could tackle him. I mean, I heard stories where literally they 11 on one, they would kick off to Bill and just try to tackle him, and he could get through them sometimes.
Wow.
But he was definitely a legend. And like I said, he graduated at what was it, 19 or 20 years old. So imagine if he had an extra 2 years, if he hadn't, graduated high school early, how good he might have been. But he was definitely, one of a kind.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny every time I any kind of trivia question dealing with UVA that's from the olden days, the answer is almost always Bill Dudley. So one thing that it's apparent when you look at the history of UVA football is that as I mentioned earlier, we struggled. Even though we were the first in the South, we had some good years under Arthur Geppy. I believe he pronounced his name right. He was a coach
Art
between
Gap.
46 and 52. We had some decent years under George Blackburn between 1965 and 1970. Um, um, why is that? Why do you think UVA only had moderate success? What was holding us back, if anything?
I tell people when they ask me to give them sort of a log line of, I'm sorry, sort of a synopsis of the UVA football documentary. I say it's a story of worsts and firsts. There are so many firsts that take place in the history of UVA football. Like I said, from being the first program in the South, the first program to have a forward pass across the line of scrimmage, first program to beat one of the elite schools in the Northeast. Um, we were the first school, believe it or not, to play an integrated football game in the South in 1947 when we hosted an integrated Harvard team. There were calls for boycotts. Politicians were getting involved. And the UVA students in 1947, a lot of them had served in World War II, had fought against Hitler and fascism, had fought alongside, other minorities, African Americans, and you said, this is the future. What are you doing? We're not going to cancel this football game with Harvard. So that was a first that took place at UVA. But then some of the worsts, like you mentioned, that down period. UVA lost 28 consecutive games at one point from 1958 to 1960, the longest losing streak in college football history. Um, really, we had success, like I mentioned at the beginning. There were some years in the 30s where they had some issues, and those had to do with, whether or not we were offering scholarships or not. UNC was doing UNC things, and as much as they like to think that they do things the right way, well, that's not always the case. Um, and really, it was like Art Gep that you mentioned, had us, in the rankings, beating teams like Penn. That was our first victory against a top 10 team, I believe, against Penn in the late 40s. And we had a bid to, I can't remember what the bowl was. We had a bid, and the president of UVA at the time said, no, we don't do bowl games at UVA. And so Art Gep got ticked off. He wanted like a $500 raise. We refused to give him a raise. So he went to Vanderbilt, and he turned their program around.
Wow.
And so really that was just a black mark on the UVA program itself. And so what college football coach, of that's really, really good would want to come to a school like that who doesn't pay you well and doesn't accept, invitations to bowl games. So, that was really the situation that we were in, all the way up until, like you mentioned, Blackburn came along, and we started to see, a modicum of success. Not the heights that we would see later, but then, when George Welsh came, he just brought a whole new mentality to UVA football. He had a great staff, great recruiters. And also we just had some fantastic athletes in the state of Virginia, and they really focused on the state of Virginia. A lot of those guys from those teams in the 80s and 90s, came from the Commonwealth.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to those happy times in a minute, but I did want to talk about the ACC a little bit. The UVA was a member of the Southern Conference, which was a enormous conference that it broke apart in the early 50s, and teams the bigger schools that wanted to play some football formed the ACC. UVA had dropped out of the Southern Conference by then, but ended up joining the ACC. What role did that have in the development of UVA football and actually UVA sports?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, like today, you're seeing with these mega conferences, the Southern Conference was basically made up of the majority of the current SEC, or at least the SEC from maybe like, 10 years ago, and the ACC. And so it broke apart because you couldn't play everyone in round robin. It was hard to, declare a champion of the league. Again, some teams were doing things a little differently than others, more scholarships than others. And, so they UVA got out a couple years early. The league broke apart. The SEC formed, then the ACC formed, and UVA. Actually, I believe, we missed out on the very first year of football in the ACC, but we were there for the first season of basketball that winter. So we came along, a couple months later from everyone else, from Duke and Maryland and UNC, NC State, Wake, et cetera. But that was interesting because they were able to play a round robin schedule. They were able to declare this is the champion of the ACC. It's really interesting that Maryland was really kind of helped start the ACC. It was really because of their program and insisting on being able to play in bowl games, and a couple other factors. And then Maryland ended up leaving the ACC, which kind of seemed like they were, I don't know, breaking a lot of people's hearts, but their own fans' hearts primarily. But it just seemed kind of, I was incredulous when they left to go to the Big Ten. But it's all about money these days, and NCAA football, it's kind of a professional league now.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned 1947, the year Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball, is the year when UVA played Harvard, an integrated team, which was big news. UVA was the last basketball team to have black players in the ACC, which is hard to believe as the second most northern school. You would have thought UVA had been earlier. I think black students started at UVA the same year women, and maybe a year after, but around the
1970.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know the name of the first UVA basketball player, African American. I'm freezing on it right now. When did the UVA start recruiting black football players? What was the first year that UVA had black football players?
Yeah, that was 1970. But at that time, um, you were not allowed to play varsity football as a freshman. So they had a freshman team.
Mhm.
So it would still be another year until 1971 when African American players were on the varsity. But 1970 was when Al Groh began his career
Oh,
as
is
a
that
college
right?
football coach, and he was the head coach of the UVA freshman team
Is that
that
right?
year.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so he ended up coaching that historic team and those Trailblazers that broke that barrier at the University of Virginia.
Oh, that's amazing. Um, so UVA was a very conservative Southern school. When you and I went to school here, we'd wear coat and tie to games. I wouldn't, but most people would. We had a pep band. I think it was still around when you were there.
Yep. Yep.
Were those traditions? How far do they go back? And I believe there's no pep band anymore, and I believe the kids don't dress up anymore. Talk a little bit about those traditions.
Yeah, I mean, the students themselves wore coat and tie to school until I think it was sometime in the early 70s. It was called the Coat and Tie Rebellion or something, where students started to just wear jeans and t-shirts and things like that. I mean, the 70s were wild, man. So things were changing. And so I think, that the only opportunity or one of the best opportunities to dress up, was at football games. And it was also the team wasn't good. So it was a date function. So students continue that tradition all the way up through the 90s. Then Al Groh was like, wanted fans to wear orange. So it kind of died out a little bit. I mean, you still might see a couple folks wearing a coat and tie, but no, I definitely did, but you don't see it as much anymore.
Yeah. And how about the pep band? What
And the
what is
pep
he?
band again, I think that was Al Groh's era where he wanted big time college football. He wanted a big time band. And the pep band had their wrist slapped, several times over the years for various stunts and antics. So, that was, the whole sense of Virginia students and self-governance really kind of was in display when it came to the pep band, lasting for as long as it did.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the 70s were a tough time for UVA football. Sonny Randall was a disaster. My high school basketball coach, Bob McKeag, played basketball and football at UVA. He just said Sonny he wasn't a very nice person and didn't do very well, lost a lot of games. Dick Beckwith, who I understand was a really good guy, guy who played quarterback in my high school, Todd Kirtley, great guy, played for Dick. He ended up going to Georgia, I believe, after UVA. I believe, or somewhere south. But they struggled. So Kevin, George Welsh was doing amazing things at the Naval Academy. He was, Naval Academy has strict rules about how many days they can practice, how long they can practice. The players had to commit to 4 years service before they could go professional, like Roger Staubach. But George Welsh was the coach that ended up turning things around in, I believe, 81, 82. Was there any relation between getting George Welsh and the success of UVA basketball in the 70s with Barry Parkhill, Wally Walker winning the ACC in 76, and of course the great Ralph Sampson? Was it time for UVA to be a big time football program as well?
That's a great question. And it is a confluence of events that happened. I don't think any one thing by itself um, led to that success that we saw. But, first of all, you mentioned George Welsh. He was an assistant for Joe Paterno at Penn State, and uh, did great things there. Went to the Naval Academy. I think the Naval Academy played Penn State his first year. I think they lost 49-0. The second year, and Georgia's second year at the Naval Academy, they beat Penn State.
Wow.
It just an amazing tactician. George was fifth in the Heisman voting when he was a player.
Is that right?
He was I mean, at 5 foot 175 pounds soaking wet. He was in Life magazine getting interviewed. I mean, he was a great athlete himself. Um, but yeah, he was looking for the next big step for himself in his career. And he even mentions when, at his opening press conference, in Charlottesville, that, they asked him, UVA is known as the graveyard for coaches. Why are you coming here? And he said, well, if it's a graveyard, it's a pretty graveyard.
Mhm.
So I think that just he was a fan of history, and he was a fan of Thomas Jefferson. He was very well read. I think that the success of the basketball team absolutely played into that. I mean, you see today when UVA won the national championship in 2019, applications to UVA skyrocketed. I mean, it's just natural that when you're in the public eye, one way or another, whether it's from one of your sports teams, that all ships rise with the tide. So I think that that really kind of came together. Those two things, the basketball team, you know, showed that success could happen at UVA. And then thirdly, Gene Corrigan as the athletic director. And Gene was the person that hired Terry Holland. Gene was the one that fought for additional scholarships for UVA football players, for additional coaches on the coaching staff. Gene had a whole plan he said, look, if we're going to do anything at UVA, we need to do it right. And he had a plan, it's called the Corrigan Report. And I think I mentioned it in the documentary. And he thought, this is either going to get me fired or it's going to lead to some good things. And it was accepted. And I think it was President Shannon, maybe was the president at UVA at the time. But that enabled him to go after George Welsh and to say, like, look, I'm going to fully complement you with a coaching staff that you need and all the resources that you need. And even though George was working out of trailers, behind U-Haul at the time, he's like, look, we're going to build the McHugh Center. We're going to get there if you'll be patient with us. So a lot of different things came into play to kind of, just hit that magic formula for success that, I mean, I'll stop there. We can talk more about the 1990 season if you want.
Yeah. So I think Frank McHugh was a prominent doctor, sports doctor. Yeah, he was a legend. So my freshman year was important because that was the year Don Mikowski, John Ford, Barry Word, Howard Petty. I'm freezing on some of the defenders because we had a good defense too.
Legends.
We went to the Peach Bowl. That was a really important year in UVA football. I believe your freshman year was the year they were number one in the country. Is that
Yes,
right?
my first year.
That was your first year. Oh,
Yeah.
freshman year. Jeez. I've been talking to my JMU student. So Kevin, so talk about your freshman year and what did that mean to you to come to UVA and to experience maybe the greatest year and besides the UVA winning the national championship in basketball recently, maybe the greatest year in UVA sports history was the year we were number one ever so briefly in 1990.
Yeah, like I said, I was spoiled. My first game ever was the Clemson game when we beat Clemson for the first time.
That's right.
I remember being on the field as the goalpost came down and carrying part of it to the lawn and setting it down on the lawn. I mean, I was just indoctrinated immediately into UVA football. I remember I was sitting on the hill and the game against Georgia Tech, where we were going for the game-winning touchdown at the end, which got called back. Not enough men on the line of scrimmage, which was the rule that William Lambeth helped establish in 1909. It came back to
Oh,
bite us. And we ended up having to kick the game tying field goal. Georgia Tech goes down and kicks the game winning field goal with under a minute left. But my first year was just, oh my God, it was so much fun. CBS Sports was there. The Shamu blimp was flying overhead. It was so much fun. I mean, that team, despite finishing 8-4 on the season because Shawn Moore broke his thumb or on the AstroTurf, might have been the best 8-4 team in college football history. We lose the bowl game to Tennessee that year on a last second field goal, like something like 23-22. We went from being not ranked the week leading into the bowl game to being ranked in the top 25 after a loss, which is just mind blowing to me. I mean, I think that the voters could see how good that UVA team was. And Shawn, coming back and played half of that game, but still, was his thumb just wasn't fully healed yet.
Yeah, I remember, Kevin. I was in law school that year, and I lived behind the corner. And every day I'd walk by the corner to go to the bus stop near the chapel to go to law school. And I remember I stopped by Mincer's and I grabbed the USA Today, and it had us #1 in the country. I never forget that day. The morning, the sky was just incredible color that day, and it was so special. And then if you the Georgia Tech game, the running back William Bell was a phenomenal player. The quarterback Shawn, can't think of the name. That was a
Jones.
great Tech team. Bobby Ross was their coach, and I've interviewed people from that team. Nicky Fisher had a play he wished he could have back. There's so many things that went into that loss. We kind of felt like everything had to go perfectly for Tech for us to actually throw that away. But one thing I'll never forget about the game was how quiet it was when the game was over. I'll never forget leaving the stadium. It was so quiet. It was like, it was
A
like a
funeral.
funeral as we left. I'll never forget that. It was, people were crying.
It
It
was a
was very
funeral for
sad.
our undefeated season, is what it was.
Yeah, it was tough. And then the Maryland loss, and then and then we had a great effort in the Orange Bowl, and the Sugar Bowl. I was Kevin. Did you get to know any of those players while you were a student? I know you interviewed many of them for the movie, but did you get to know them as a
Yeah,
student?
I had a couple, let's see, I had an offensive lineman. It was in my suite my first year. I remember he took me around a couple parties and, met some players, and they just seemed like gods to me. I mean, these guys were huge. And just, seeing them on TV and then seeing them in person was kind of crazy. And then, years later, getting a chance to meet them, face to face for these interviews. I did a collective interview with Shawn Moore and Terry Kirby and Herman Moore and Chris Slade. We did kind of a group dinner set up for their interview. And it was funny, I had not yet met them in person, but I was introduced to Shawn through email. And that guy is just a born leader. I mean,
Yes.
whether he's leading his team to the 1989 ACC title or whether he's emailing his buddies to inspire them to come to Washington, D.C. to shoot this interview for a no-name guy who's trying to make this documentary. He's just so passionate and just, I mean, you can see why people want to follow him. And he's just a great human being.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great names. Also great names that you probably talked to, definitely watched. One of my heroes, Heath Miller. I'm a Steeler fan. Chris Long, Rondé Barber. So talk about those guys, and the impact they had on the program.
Oh man, all the guys that you mentioned, they were huge, and we were fortunate enough to be able to interview them for the documentary. And most of them were in the middle of their NFL careers at that time, so it was really gracious of them to like give up their time, to be a part of the documentary. It was just a continuation of the George Welsh success, and some of the defensive players that you mentioned. I always find it fascinating that, in 1990, I believe we had the #1 ranked offense in the country, whether it was yards per game, points per game, whatever the metrics were. We were an offensive juggernaut. And then the following year, we had the best defense in the country in 1991. I mean, that just shows how good George Welsh was, not just on one side of the ball, even though he was a quarterback and offensive coordinator. So I'd like to see the success of all of those players that you mentioned, even going into the NFL. I mean, UVA was just a breeding ground for these NFL stars, and hopefully one day get back to that.
Yeah, exactly. We will. Hope springs eternal. Let's talk a little bit more about Al Groh. Now, I love the Bill and Bill 30 for 30, Bill Parcells.
Mhm.
Bill Belichick, and Al Groh figures prominently. Al Groh, you mentioned earlier, he was a freshman coach at UVA in '71 with the first integrated team. But he also was a defense coordinator for Belichick and had a great reputation as a defensive coach and a leader generally. Came to UVA, definitely had some success early. Um, Probably, not looked at in the same light as George Welsh. How do you, what do you think about the Al Groh years, and why don't you think it was a success it probably should have been, given the level of coach he was?
Yeah, I mean, he came in that first recruiting class that he brought in. I mean, folks were excited, and just again focusing on the in-state talent was such a key to his success, I think, in those early years. You know, we had some unlucky bounces. I mean, and every team does, and some unlucky injuries and things like that. But we still had a pretty good team, a team that was, over the first half of his, tenure at UVA. I think anybody today would take that in a heartbeat. I think that, he had some defections on the staff that he wasn't necessarily able to fill with the same caliber, perhaps. Um, and then once you get a little bit of a losing streak against your in-state rival, and things kind of start to snowball just a little bit, it becomes harder and harder. And he got stuck in a situation where maybe he didn't, have the staff that he wanted, and uh, he wasn't getting the recruits that he needed. He was an interesting guy to interview for the documentary. I remember, I interviewed him his last season at UVA because I interviewed people over the course of about 4 years, and he was really hesitant because I think that he didn't know if this was going to be a hatchet job. He didn't know if, I was going to be really critical of him. So I had to kind of convince him that, look, I'm looking at the larger history of the program. I'm not trying to get into the minutia of why this person failed or this person succeeded or things like that. So I think that, when my opening question to him was, why did you choose to come to UVA as a student? Like, you could just see his defenses let down and the smile on his face. And he just had a genuine love for UVA. I mean, he really spoke fondly of coming to UVA from way up in New York. He said it felt like he was getting in a horse covered wagon to come down to the South to go to school. But he said that he had a great time as a player. He admits he wasn't a great player, but loved the sport, and it led to his career where he has a Super Bowl ring, and he coached at several college programs. He was at Wake Forest for a while too, and obviously, at UVA. But he was a little bristly at times with the media, with fans and people questioning, his different decisions. And he's just old school, man. I mean, he didn't suffer fools. And I think if he grew up, in the sport and today, maybe there's be more media training, or maybe he would have seen at an earlier age how people handle interviews. But when it just came to the knowledge of football, I mean, you talk to Matt Schaub says Al Groh knows more in his little finger than most coaches know in a lifetime.
Yeah.
So his players, absolutely loved him for the most part.
Yeah, you got media training from Bill Parcells. To show you what kind of coach Al Groh is, when Belichick left Parcells' staff to go to the Browns, the Browns didn't work out. Really wasn't his fault. It was more of a move back to Baltimore, I believe it was. So Belichick came back to Parcells' staff. I think by then they were at New England, or maybe they're still at the Jets. But he kept Al Groh as a defense coordinator. And Bill Belichick is one of the greatest defensive coaches ever in football. And he thought enough of Al Groh to keep Belichick. Belichick became the assistant head coach. So that just shows you about Al Groh. So look, after the movie, Mike London becomes coach, and which is a landmark moment for UVA. We talked about integration in 71, but he was the first black head football coach. I think there'd been a black basketball coach. Talk a little bit about the Mike London years. I know this is post documentary, but obviously you're a huge fan, and he's had great success at University of Richmond, I believe. But his record at UVA was a little bit uneven, to say the least.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that 4 year span where I was interviewing people bridged Mike London's preseason, right as he was heading into his first season as coach at UVA. So I was fortunate enough to be able to interview him. And he won a national championship at Richmond. He was from the Commonwealth. He had coached at UVA in the past. I mean, he checked every box. And talk about personable. I mean, just one of the most likable guys and just a great human being. I mentioned Shawn Moore, being a great person. Mike London would give the shirt off his back to somebody who needed it. I mean, he really was a player's coach. But he was coming into a Division I program that had high expectations. People were still thinking that, we could get back up to the levels of the George Welsh years and the early years of Al Groh. And we did, fairly well. 2010, I think, was a bowl season for us. But, again, his coaching staff, he brought in a lot of guys from what was then, called Division II or Division I AA, that maybe didn't have the confidence of the administration, possibly. So there was some pressure on him to bring in more experienced assistant coaches. And when you get into that situation where the head coach is not able to make those decisions on his own and he's having to please others, I mean, sometimes it works out, but if it doesn't, I mean, it's kind of a recipe for failure. So, I think that Craig Littlepage was a fantastic athletic director. I, to this day, laud John Oliver for bringing Tony Bennett to UVA. I mean, I don't want to say that I will take mediocrity in football in exchange for a national championship in basketball, but we have a national championship in basketball, and John Oliver was a big part of that.
Yeah.
Now, he perhaps thought that, maybe that guidance could be used in the football world too. And, that didn't necessarily work out. He then, if can segue into Bronco,
Sure.
Mendenhall took sort of a different path in terms of looking for the coach to succeed Mike London. And again, got a guy from out west. Tony Bennett was at Washington State, and Bronco Mendenhall at BYU, but had a track record for success at BYU. And so it was another situation where he won the ACC with Bronco, so again, today, take that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, from what I understand about Bronco, there was a cultural disconnect with Bronco. Maybe he was kind of old school values or something that some of the players just, from what I understand, just didn't connect with him. It wasn't that he wasn't a great football coach. I think it was that. But let's move on to Tony Elliott. And before we get to Tony Elliott, who seems like a great guy, Clemson, an engineer, a walk on, had a great career at Clemson, and also an assistant there. But one thing that clouds Tony Elliott's career, and it's not his fault, obviously, is the tragedy with Devin Chandler, Lavelle Davis, Deshaun Perry. Now, your son Ethan was a student at UVA when that happened, as my son Chandler was. So we'll never forget that night because we both were wondering where our sons were.
Yeah.
Um, as a guy who's given a lot to UVA, not only did you go there, but you spent a lot of time and thought and energy with UVA and its history. What did the tragedy do to you personally, and how did you deal with it?
Gosh, I can't even comment on, myself. I mean, my heart just to this day goes out to the families, and to the friends. And it is just so mind blowing, to have these guys with their whole future ahead of them, just have it snuffed out. gosh, Tony Elliott had a challenge without that, but then with that tragedy on top of it, I mean, I think that he handled it as best as anyone could. I mean, it's uh, you can just tell the compassion that he has for the families, for those players themselves, for their teammates, for the community, and he had to wear that and be the spokesperson and the representative of the program. And their memories, they will always be honored, by the university. I was just visiting 2 weeks ago, went to visit my son, like you mentioned, who's in architecture school, and saw Beta Bridge someone had painted over their numbers.
Hmm.
They thought maybe it had been too long.
Hmm.
Within a day, supposedly, painted again with their numbers.
That's
It's like, no,
great.
no, no, no. We
Yeah.
we decide when it's time to paint over that. So, those guys, their legacy will remain, for a long time. And Tony, he's moving forward, but not forgetting. I think that's very, commendable. And I'm excited to see what they're going to do this year. It's an interesting quarterback battle that's going on,
Yeah, it's
and
cool.
there's definitely some excitement, but a tough schedule this year. Really, really tough schedule. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I believe he won 3 games both years. And obviously, I think there's an understanding that he was coaching through very difficult times. But I think this year, people are going to start expecting results. And as you also mentioned, the schedule is very tough. Do you believe if given a fair chance that Coach Elliott can take us to the next level or back to the same level where we belong?
Yes, I mean the new football facility is a huge help to recruiting, to strength and conditioning, to the overall sort of mood and atmosphere around the program, I would imagine. I'm not an insider, so I'm just guessing at this as, a fan from afar. He seems to be very methodical with his approach. He seems to not make knee-jerk reactions. I think that's, very helpful when it comes to being a coach. So, it again, I go back to, can you get the recruits from the state of Virginia? And I think that they've tried to, you know, I don't know if mend some fences is the right term, but perhaps strengthen, the bonds between the high schools in the state of Virginia to try to get those players to stay in state. Obviously, we have a very wide reach because of our academic standards. We need to look outside of the state, perhaps more so than other programs. But I think yeah, I think that, we've seen some glimpses. If he can get the depth on the offensive line, if he can, there's a myriad of things that need to go into it. But yeah, I don't think that this year is going to be the defining year of whether he makes it or not. Hopefully, I still think that he has a little bit of a runway to kind of show what he can do.
Yeah. And unfortunately, Kevin, I think one thing that's important to our future is how we can compete on the NIL horizon, which is one of those things. It's still kind of an unknown. I think the Southern schools, who we had a advantage over 120 years ago,
Right.
have eclipsed us. Have eclipsed
Right,
us.
right. Hey,
You know,
man, don't discount Low Davis. He's out there, man.
yeah, our buddy
Yeah.
Lowe's a great guy. So Kevin, this has been great. I've been trying to get you to do this for a long time. I'm so glad you finally you had some time to do this. When you think about projects that I know you've complained to me in the past that sometimes it's hard to monetize these things with all the quality and effort that you put into this kind of work. If you had to tell another story about UVA, what other kind of story would you want to tell? Are there other aspects of UVA or maybe even UVA sports that you'd like to to tell us about if you had a chance and maybe the money?
Oh, that's interesting. Gosh, people have said like, why don't you do a documentary about the basketball team? And, there is a documentary that's out, a couple years ago after we won the national championship. I love history so much. So to me, there would have to be a story that would capture people's imagination, um, for any of our sports programs that go back long ways. And while UVA's basketball program started, I think, in 1905, we weren't involved in the formation of the rules of the game, or whether there should be scholarships or not, or whether a three-pointer should be allowed or not. So it would be, a story about UVA. Would definitely be open to it. If anyone who's watching this has one of those stories that that they think would be worthwhile, reach out to me. We can talk. I mean, it's funny, the documentary that I mentioned called The King of Kong, the way that was started was, I think that a guy named Ed Cunningham, who was an offensive lineman in the
Yeah.
NFL, and he
Mount
was
Vernon
like,
High School. He's the local guy.
oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
he's from up here. Yeah.
oh, wow, small world. He was working for ESPN, went to visit a friend in Seattle, Washington, a high school buddy, was at a bar and heard someone mention this story about two guys vying for the world record in Donkey Kong. And he heard about the fighting between these two guys and the stories, and it was like, this has to be a documentary. And so a story for a good documentary can come from anywhere. So listen, Julian, if you can think of anything that's captivating, let me know. We can figure it out. Maybe we can find some UVA alumni to try to financially support it,
Yeah.
get into some film festivals, and we'll become executive producers.
Exactly. Kevin, I think it'd be fun to collaborate on a project about the integration years in the ACC between 65 and 71 with Charlie Scott, UNC basketball player, Hall of Famer. I think it's Art Jones from University of Maryland was the first Black player, I believe. But the UVA in 71, I would be fascinated. I talked to a guy named Pat Toomey. I don't know if you ever heard of Pat. Pat wrote the book on any given Sunday, which led to the movie Any Given Sunday. And Pat played for Vanderbilt. He was a all pro pass rusher for the Cowboys and the Broncos. But anyway, he was there at Vanderbilt when they integrated the basketball team at Vanderbilt. He played for Gep at Vanderbilt football, but he also played freshman basketball. And he had amazing stories about what the players went through when they traveled south to
Yeah.
play. And it's not the they're not the cheeriest
Yeah.
tales in the world,
There's
but
a
they're
great
always
documentary.
fascinating.
There's a great documentary called The Tournament that was
Oh,
on the ATC network.
amazing.
It details a lot of these stories.
Yeah, that's an amazing. So maybe the story's already been told. But one of these days, Kevin, we have to collaborate on something.
Yeah. It's funny, like our origin story goes way back before we even knew each other. And you can cut this out if you want, if this, this is worthwhile. But I think we've mentioned it before. Intramural basketball, when you were in law school, I think your independent team won the independent division. My fraternity won the fraternity
Oh,
division. And
yeah.
I think we play each other, but we didn't know each other.
Yeah, it's crazy. Even you mentioned that UVA message board. My team was named Run and Gun, and people still talk about that team. Because we were a very unlikely team. They
We
had
were
two
good.
older professors from Piedmont Community College that were great shooters. I was a point guard, and we had a guy named Clarence Massey who was local. So it was a hodgepodge bunch of guys. But we were very
Did
tough
you have
team.
one of my favorite former UVA basketball players on
Andrew
that team?
Benetti was on our team.
Andrew Venenti.
How
Oh
could
my
I not
God.
mention him? Oh, Jesus.
He is a slaughter legend in the early 90s. That guy would come in, looked like Super Mario, but with go-go gadget arms.
Yeah.
And he would walk in and he would win 8 games and then say, see you later, kids.
So in 78, Andrew graduated in 71 or 72, high school in New York City. But in 78, 79, he was voted one of the 25 best high school players in the history of New York City. Andrew's in real estate. He's been in real estate in Charlottesville for many years. You want to Yeah.
I've got another one for you. Up until Kenny Anderson came out of New York City, Kenny Anderson was lauded as the best left-hander to come out of New York City since Andrew Benintendi. But how do you pronounce his last name?
It's been, yeah, that's it. You
Yeah,
got it.
yeah.
But yeah,
So Andrew was considered the best left-hander to come out of New York City until Kenny Anderson.
yeah. Andrew tells a great story. I've never been able to get him to come on the podcast, but my high school basketball coach, Bob McKegg, and Andrew are best friends. So I knew Andrew before I went to UVA. But Andrew, he tells so many funny stories. And one story he tells is he came to UVA and he used to play basketball barefooted. That was his thing. But he was at UVA and his girlfriend was back home in New York City, and he heard she was dating somebody else. So he went on 29, he hitchhiked back home. Back then they hitchhiked, and he asked her to marry her and brought her to UVA, and they got married right away. And so
Oh,
she lived,
wow.
yeah, that's how he ended up getting married. So
That'd be
Andrew
awesome.
is amazing, kind of a hipster type of dude. And anyone who plays pickup basketball at UVA up until probably I think 5 years ago. I think he was still trying to play 5 years ago, but he
Really?
tore an Achilles. So
Oh,
I think he finally had to give it up. So
yeah, he was a slaughter legend for sure.
oh, he was a great
As
player.
were you.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I definitely tried, and I always surrounded myself with great players. So, but look, again, Kevin, this has been great. I'm so glad we did this. We used to, last time I saw Adrian, we had dinner at Great Raise a Steak.
Oh, wow.
We double dated at Raise a Steak.
Wow.
It must have been probably 10 years ago, maybe.
Hmm.
I remember you guys were getting work done on your house at the
Yep.
time,
Yep. That was the
and
time.
you guys were listening. And you bought like a monitor. So I guess our kids must have been really young. So you didn't have a babysitter for the kids, so they must have been under 10 or 11 years old at the time.
Yeah.
So
So Raise the Stakes is literally across the street from the apartment complex that we
that's
were
what it was.
staying in when our house was getting renovated.
Yeah,
And we brought the baby monitor. I mean, they were 6 and 4 years old, maybe. I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe they were older than that. But like literally, if we heard a noise, we could have been back to the apartment in 30 seconds. And they
exactly.
were at asleep.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to get you arrested or anything, but
I know.
yeah, I
I was
remember.
just thinking back on it, like, what was I doing?
Yeah, we met you a little bit later, so I think they're probably 10 and 8 or 11 and 9.
Okay, then maybe that was it.
Yeah, they couldn't have been that young because I don't think I met you until
Oh
the kids were
yeah, it was
playing
fifth. They were
soccer.
in, they were in fifth grade and third grade. That's what it
Yeah,
was.
so it wasn't that bad.
Yeah,
So
not yeah.
yeah. So anyway, we got to get together, Kevin. And look, I appreciate you
Sure.
doing this, and I hope Liam and Ethan continue to prosper. Smart kids, very athletic kids. Especially Liam was a really good basketball player and soccer player. So
Yeah, you're gonna be an empty nester soon, couple years.
yeah, yeah. So we'll have plenty of time to get together.
All right, man. Sounds good.
Yeah, Kevin, this has been great. Thanks again for doing it.
Thanks, Julian.
All right, buddy.